Okay, so before we jump into what is really kind of the last model until we get into the growth models, sort of the last week of the semester. So we're sort of setting up kind of the kind of end of this third week, and what I want to do by the end of this third week is I want to establish really one key thing, and then maybe hopefully get to a couple of other less key, but I think important things nonetheless. The thing we're going to get to is called the dynamic aggregate supply aggregate demand model. You may have noticed up to this point that there has not really been a way for us to embed expectations, the Phillips curve, or anything like that into aggregate supply, aggregate demand. It sort of exists kind of as separate ideas, and then we sort of shoehorn things in. I think once you sort of understand aggregate supply, aggregate demand really well, you sort of ISLM and Mundell Fleming and all that, you sort of, I think, are left with still a little bit of this sort of um, unsatisfaction and in prices and inflation and all of that. Just that seems to be the least, in a sense, believable part, perhaps, of those particular frameworks. Which is the reason I think monetarism, post Keynesian sort of monetarist, eventually this translates into sort of rule based monetary policy, Taylor rule, and all that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about. This I think arises because, at least in part, of that dissatisfaction people felt about the sort of Keynesian world. It did not really say a lot about inflation, and a lot of what people had come up with up until the Phillips curve did not sort of add much to the inflation story within that Keynesian context. I mean, think about ISLM. There is no prices in ISLM. We fix price in ISLM, and that is a complication and an assumption that I think is very restrictive ultimately. So the sort of rise of monetarism in the 60s is not just a story of the data, although the data is a big part of that story, but it's also because the Keynesian models had not been developed enough yet to where they incorporated a lot of what we had been learning about, in particular, inflation and unemployment. And so that's going to be the aggregate supply, aggregate demand in the dynamic sense. That's going to be a large part of that story. Before we get into that, though, I just wanted to kind of very quickly take us through the history of the 60s and 70s, and in particular, a focus on policy. And then talk about a little bit of that in the context of inflation, the economy, and then presidential elections, because I think that's a really important part of the story here. And it brings into a lot of interesting conversations regarding Fed independence and the fact that the president appoints the Fed chairman and so on and so forth, and the nature of the Federal Reserve as a public-private entity, and the abstraction I think sometimes that can sort of cause. So the sort of beginning of this very hopefully short story is the beginning of the 1960s. So you have Kennedy, who wins the election against Nixon. A lot of reason why people think that occurred is at least in part because of this recessionary sort of moment that the U.S. had come into, and that's important, by the way. That becomes a very important, I think, origin story of Nixon in his reemergence in terms of politics. A really interesting guy. You think about Nixon, loses the 1960 presidential election, loses then the governor election, and then ultimately becomes president. It's a interesting way to think about it. Um, so the Kennedy tax cuts. So Kennedy kind of emerges at the beginning of the 1960s. So we can sort of just say Kennedy here. So Kennedy cuts taxes in the early part of the 1960s. I think he sees himself as sort of this transformative. I'm going to kind of boost the economy through these tax cuts. I'm going to be the Democrat who supports tax cuts, which had historically been sort of this economic idea. Conservative idea. And the U.S. economy responds quite well. If we just have inflation and federal funds rate here, but you can see sort of very quickly after these tax cuts are at least being signaled and eventually implemented. And the big thing these tax cuts did is they brought down the top marginal tax rate, which was above 90%, brought that down to just above 70%. And that, of course, was a large boon, especially to high income earners. and sort of, in a sense, was seen as a Keynesian policy in response to the recession in 1960. So the Kennedy tax cuts, I think, are sort of spun as like Kennedy having conservative economic policy because he cut taxes. But Keynes would have argued that, hey, a tax cut is an aggregate demand expansion. It's expansionary fiscal policy. So we have, expansionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand goes up. Kennedy, has sort of fairly robust domestic spending that puts upward pressure on aggregate demand. Then of course, we have the war machine starting to ramp up as we head into the Johnson administration after the assassination of Nixon. And then the other interesting thing that's happening during this time period is that if you look at monetary policy, that's why I have this here, you'll notice that all the way through the 1960s, like monetary policy is fairly tight. There's fairly tight monetary policy right up until this moment here. And then right in 1966, you'll notice that the Fed starts targeting a lower federal funds rate. So like all of a sudden, monetary policy became expansionary. And so if you look at that time in particular, that's where you really start to see this sort of inflation story start to come up. And of course, the sort of economic historical context here is that this is when Friedman is really coming on the scene. One of his big papers in 1968 basically argues that inflation has inertia. And again, remember, the Keynesian models didn't really even talk much about inflation. And so what Friedman was able to do was basically position himself and say, look, my argument is that Keynesianism is inflationary. Look at all this inflation. Look at all this, what Friedman was able to argue. Look at all this Keynesian economic policy, right? The reality is that it's not Keynesian to overheat the economy, right? The Keynes sort of, I think, believed, okay, if the economy's in dysfunction, boost aggregate demand, and then let's use monetary policy to kind of soothe inflationary fears. So if you look in the 1960s, that seems to be exactly what happened. We have expansionary fiscal policy through tax cuts, government spending, war in Vietnam, Johnson's war on poverty. All of these are pro-inflationary spending policies. And you can see that inflation sort of remains really low, like relatively low, right? And part of that story is the sort of tight monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. That's, in a sense, exactly what Keynes would have prescribed. Keynes would not have prescribed, I don't think, this sudden monetary expansion in the late part of the 1960s. That's the part where you really go into overheat the economy. And I think Friedman seized on that in many ways, fair or not fair. And again, it was like, if you're not going to talk about inflation, other people are going to come in and they're going to sort of take that space. And that's sort of what happened. The irony, of course, is the sort of political party that would come to kind of utilize Friedman the most, Republicans, they put through Nixon, who obviously eventually wins the 1968 election. Nixon basically says, look, I'm going to spend a lot of money and I'm going to cut taxes and we're going to just continue growing the economy. Nixon basically signals a very pro-inflationary administration, and he does exactly that. So the Vietnam War continues, increases in government spending. Again, we already had tax cuts that kind of fueled aggregate demand at the beginning of the semester. The other thing, of course, is that Nixon appoints Arthur Burns, who was a friend of Nixon, who was sort of a politician first before a Fed chairman. And so, Burns accommodated Nixon. So Nixon's running the economy very hot. Keynesian policy would say, okay, the Fed should step in, tighten monetary policy to bring inflation down. Burns didn't do this. Burns further dropped the federal funds rate. You'll notice here the blue line at the beginning of the 1970s is a dramatic decrease in the federal funds rate. Now, the argument would be, well, we are coming out of a recession, so it makes a lot of sense, that the federal funds rate would certainly decline. And that is true. This recession ends up being sort of relatively small, does not sort of end up kind of disrupting things too much. So the argument was that this dramatic of a federal funds rate cut target was not necessary, was overly inflationary, overly boosting of aggregate demand. And then you see that very quickly where there starts to be this sort of inflationary pressure in the economy. And so just inflationary policy, inflationary policy, inflationary policy. Then we experience inflation. The interesting thing about this story is that that inflationary story doesn't stop. There is also the supply shocks of the 1970s, which, as you can see, supply shock here in the mid 1970s further pushed up inflation. Supply shock here in the end of the 1970s further pushing up inflation. It's interesting to kind of look at inflation here and think about it in terms of plateaus. So inflation goes up, kind of plateaus here, does not come all the way back down, goes back up again, kind of plateaus, and then doesn't come back down until, of course, we have very, very restrictive monetary policy under Volcker. So the kind of remaining part of the story is that obviously, Nixon steps down, Ford replaces Nixon, Ford keeps Burns, Burns sort of continues to target low interest rates. In fact, Burns' sort of argument is it changes. It sort of Burns starts talking about maintaining output. Burns, the language he's using is about keeping the economy growing. It's not even about inflation at all. Burns is not even really thinking about inflation, which is very interesting. So Burns commits to increasing output. The recession also stirred re-election concerns for Ford. So there's always this sort of aggregate demand boost from proposed government spending. The interesting thing that happens during this time period from the sort of Fed's perspective historically is that we have this first establishment of the dual mandate. Prior to 1978, there was no such thing as the dual mandate. Now there's a congressional mandate of the Federal Reserve to do two things: maintain low, stable inflation and commit to full employment. The language of these bills is actually quite interesting. The word full employment was really avoided for a long time. They used maximum employment. The word natural unemployment never even showed up. So it's really interesting. There's always sort of this dancing around of what exactly does the dual mandate mean. Nowadays, I think it's more clear: low, stable inflation and full employment. So that's kind of the way that we frame it now. And then some really interesting things happen. So Carter is elected in 78, in part likely because of the recession in 75 and the concerns over the economy. The U.S. economy is really ground to a bit of a halt. Carter has this famous speech that he gives called the Malaise speech, in which he says the U.S. economy is essentially asleep. And so he commits to, when he first is elected, the whole story is, I'm going to get the economy back to moving. But there had been basically 2 decades of inflationary pressure. And then there was another supply shock at the very tail end of the 1970s. And so we enter into a recession fairly quickly, fairly late in Carter's tenure. And the reason why this recession happens is actually very much sort of by Carter's doing. So what ends up happening is that Carter initially appoints William Miller. So William Miller is a Fed chairman who's not there very long. Miller, like Burns before him, commits to to growing the economy. I mean, his language isn't even mentioning inflation. But then what's interesting about Miller is that he gets moved to Treasury. And so when he's moved to Treasury, the language that Carter starts using, the concern that Carter starts having, really reflects the inflationary pressure that we're seeing in the economy. And that malaise concern gives way to a concern about inflation. And so Carter responds by basically finding someone who he trusted to commit to bringing inflation down. Because you have to remember, Burns didn't want to deal with inflation because that would run him afoul of Nixon. Miller didn't want to commit to fighting inflation because it was all about growing the economy, right? The economy is under malaise. But then there was this sudden realization by folks that, oh my God, inflation is the problem, partly because of the influence of monetarists. Volcker was very much a monetarist influenced person. So Carter literally went out and found someone who agreed with Friedman and agreed that what we should do is bring inflation down. And in particular, we should target money supply growth rates. And so Volcker is appointed. We start targeting money supply growth rates. We have a 79 recession. Reagan is elected. Reagan reappoints Volcker, and Volcker continues to commit to fighting inflation all the way through the first couple of years of Reagan's tenure. There's a very serious recession in 1981. That again, that's the classic Volcker recession. And so you sort of start this 2 decade with a Democratic president cutting taxes, and you end the 2 decade period with a Democrat choosing a very inflationary hawk Fed chairman who probably is at least part of the reason why he lost that election, because the economy had tipped into recession, and people don't like recessions. And so I think there's a really interesting kind of bit of story here, which is that fighting inflation is the right economic thing to do. We should have fought inflation at the end of the 1960s. We should have fought inflation at the beginning of the 1970s. Now, you can't fault people for not seeing the supply shock that came, but because we had not been fighting inflation in the 1960s and the early 1970s, those supply shocks just made everything way worse. It's just sort of, there's an additive process, if you will, to inflation. And so to kind of the end result of that is that Carter is sort of blamed for the recessions that really are mostly triggered by the appointment of someone who has said, I'm going to fight inflation. So what's sort of interesting, I think, about this, and sort of to put a button on this, is that the expectations part of the story is really that this 79 recession is about the expectation that we were going to start fighting inflation, because Carter also starts sort of saying, we're going to fight inflation, we're going to bring inflation in. Carter briefly flirts with wage and price controls. But by the way, that's something I didn't mention. Nixon, right? That was one thing Nixon tried to do. He tried to fight inflation with wage and price controls. It was a complete disaster. Luckily, Carter didn't actually pursue that particular policy, but it was there, right? That sort of, we need to do something about inflation. Whereas Nixon just sort of hand waved it and didn't really do anything. Burns didn't do anything. Carter did some things, and then, of course, Volcker did many things. And as a result, I think many people feel like Reagan was elected partly upon the weakness of the U.S. economy that was sort of this expectation of future inflationary fighting occurred. I think, to sort of look back on that and say whether that was good or bad is a really bit besides the point. If you just look at the U.S. economy post the 1980s, a remarkable era of low federal funds rate and low inflation. So that means the U.S. economy is very pro-investment, but not very pro-inflationary over that particular time period. And I think the argument would be is that the reason why we were able to experience this relative stability is because of a lot of the lessons we learned during this time period. So I think, far from seeing these eras as just all about bad economic policy or good economic policy, it's about us learning what we should be doing, which I think puts a really interesting spin on all these models and theories that we've been talking about.